morning or say afternoon. It's great to see a full room here. I actually kind of didn't expect that because I realized many of you are on fall break, which I just found out when I showed up here. So if that's you and you're going to class, thanks for still coming out here today. I'm really excited to be at the Gun Institute. It's a place I've heard a lot about. I haven't been here. And I'm also excited to be here with my graduate school friend, Kayleigh Ward, and my other graduate school friend who's hosting us and really arranged this talk, Dr. Jennifer Lai, who's on faculty here in the Department of Sociology. So sort of a Michigan State University sociology reunion. And then my graduate advisor and mentor, Tom Dietz, is here, who just assumed the emeritus status at Michigan State. And he has a long-time connection to the community here and been a long-time affiliate of the Gun Institute. So being here feels like things have really come together. And so I'm really excited to have this talk. Me and Kayleigh are doing this together, which I think is different. A lot of the gun exchange talks usually is just one person. So we're kind of gonna split the 30 minutes. So we'll both be pretty brief and we'll talk for about 15 minutes. And we're kind of brainstorming. The things we're talking about kind of different. What should we title this talk? How are we going to go about this? And I've been thinking a lot about an environmental studies course I have right now. I'm talking with my students. We talk a lot about the different forms of expertise and how they're not always necessarily equally valued, but they're all important in solving complex environmental problems. So an example of this could be thinking about science as a form of expertise, but then so is like local or indigenous knowledge. But even in the case of looking at scientific disciplines, there's a lot of different fields that don't always communicate with each other well. But today we're bringing a sociological perspective. Being both sociologists are thinking about some of the things that social sciences can offer to solve environmental problems, while of course also acknowledging the interdisciplinary nature of environmental studies, environmental research, and environmental problems. All right, let's see. So it's the Gun Institute. There's a lot of talk and thinking about sustainability and sustainable development. When we define these things, we typically think about the classic definitions of balancing needs of the present with those of the future, balancing human well-being with environmental and non-human well-being. But this is a very broad term, right? It's social scientists. We need to think about how we actually really are defining these things, how we're operationalizing and measuring them. So one important question I want to pose, and that the work I'm talking about today is really centered around is really what is human well-being? How do we define that? You could probably all quickly think of how you would describe that, and then recognize there's a lot of different approaches to this. It's a very value-laden concept. And indeed, in scientific literature, there's a lot of different ways to think about this. But the ancient philosophers as well, you look at work of Confucius or Aristotle, right? They thought about these things a lot too. So as we know, there's been a tendency to use economic measures, such as gross domestic product per capita, median household income, by both scientists and policymakers, sort of a proxy measure to well-being, which makes some sense, but that's problematic. So we see this a lot, but in being an environmental center here, we can think about how, for one, a lot of these measures don't take into account environmental degradation that can threaten sustainability and long-term well-being. They tend to not be very good at incorporating inequalities within society. And they make this assumption that what makes a person's life good is simply a function of income and wealth. And while those things can contribute to a lot of well-being, certainly there's other factors here, right? So scientists trying to think about how else can we define well-being and measure it. And one concept and approach that's become very popular in recent decades is this idea of subjective well-being, which refers to, it's a broad concept that emphasizes how individuals evaluate the quality of their own lives. This includes usually two core components: life satisfaction, which is literally people evaluating how they think their lives are overall, which is what more so I'm focusing on now, but also be aware that there's a lot of measures designed to emphasize the presence and intensity of people's positive and negative emotions during a certain period of time. And these are also considered measures of subjective well-being. So subjective well-being is the topic of 170,000 books and articles in a lot of fields, notably economics and psychology. It's been praised for its democratic nature. has high cross-cultural validity. For that reason, it is used in a lot of cross-national surveys. There's been guides put out by the United Nations Development Program, the National Research Council, and OECD on how to measure it cross-nationally. It's been found to be very receptive to a variety of social influences, including income and wealth, but also a lot of other household characteristics. And it converges well with what is often called objective measures of well-being, such as measures of physical health, or measures based on things such as the capabilities approach. Some of you may be familiar with, like Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum as to, what things can people do and what opportunities do they have. So because of these characteristics, people have, felt that it could proceed on pretty solid grounds in research studies. But despite how popular subjective well-being is, these large international organizations are interested in it. Over 40 countries are measuring it amongst their population. There's a lack of research on really how it's still related to environmental conditions, which, as we can see from a sustainable development standpoint, is really important. As a sociologist, I also note that there's a lack of engagement in the concept within sociology, which seems like a shortcoming considering that we're a field that focuses on the intersection of subjective perceptions and objective conditions. So it seems like sociologists would be really well suited to continue with this work. I think closing these gaps are important because of this big interest in subjective well-being as an international indicator of well-being, but also its potential for it as a useful indicator in sustainable development assessment, which we need. As we think about United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, there's 17 of them. Some of them correspond very much to social and more human affairs, some of them directly to environmental affairs. It's useful to have some indicators that are receptive to both environmental variables and social variables. And if that's the case for subjective well-being, then perhaps it's a very useful concept and variable to proceed with. So what I'm going to do here is, in my brief time, is I'm going to talk through an example of a study that looks at some of these things. My goal is to inspire people that are interested to engage with this concept, think about how to define well-being, measure it, think about how we can best understand it from both the human and environmental standpoint. So this is a paper that I'm revising right now with Tom Dietz and also our colleague at Michigan State, Kenneth Frank, called Cross-National Social and Environmental Influences on Life Satisfaction, one of those components of subjective well-being. The purpose of the study essentially was to examine how a variety of individual and country level social, such as income and household characteristics, but also environmental factors, influence individuals' self-rated life satisfaction. By life satisfaction, in this case, it was measured by a metric called Cantrill's ladder, which has been used for decades in large cross-national surveys, which essentially asked respondents to imagine a ladder that has 10 steps on it, and the bottom would represent the worst possible life, and the top would represent the best possible life. And essentially, respondents, they say what step they are on the ladder. In the case of this talk, I'm focusing on these environmental variables that included satisfaction with local air and water quality, and with the national government, wherever the person lives, efforts to preserve the environment. And then there was a couple country level environmental variables, which is something called carbon intensity of the country's economy, which is how much kilograms of carbon dioxide are emitted per unit of GDP, and then the percent of terrestrial protected areas within that country. So the data from the study, for the most part, the individual local data, were from what's called the Gallup World Poll, which is a big international poll that's ongoing throughout the year. It's been happening for about 17 or 18 years now. So this sample was just from 2019, consisted of 97,000 adults living across 97 countries. One of the great things about this data source is that it's very diverse in the sense that it includes numerous high, medium, and low income economies across all continents. The country level data were largely from the World Bank, as well as other sources. And then we used a regression technique called multi-level modeling to account for the fact that the individuals are clustered within the countries they live in. And we would expect those who live within each of these countries to be more like each other than two people living within different countries would. So just really summarizing this quickly, some of the notable results and conclusions, at least relevant for the subject today, is that we found that life satisfaction was positively associated with satisfaction with the local air and water quality, as well as the government's environmental preservation efforts, even when controlling for these other household characteristics and income and wealth, which is important to note because it demonstrates again that indeed well-being cannot be summarized well simply by looking at these economic characteristics. There's other characteristics that are important, including ones relevant to the environment. The country level environmental variables were only significant when not controlling for those other variables. So that included percent protected areas and the carbon intensity of the economy. But these results are interesting because, for one, they emphasize the need to consider environmental variables in examining drivers of well-being, both in subjective well-being research and in any other form. It also suggests that emitting more carbon dioxide emissions per unit of GDP didn't contribute to higher life satisfaction, which is notable because usually we do see a strong relationship between just carbon dioxide emissions and a country's GDP. But this suggests that to some extent those can be decoupled. Countries can think about ways to produce high levels of well-being by leveraging their other natural, social, and human resources, economic resources, rather than simply needing to engage in activities that could be harmful to the local or global environment. And I think really important to think about here is the fact that life satisfaction was receptive to both the social and environmental variables suggests that there's some potential for it to be very useful sustainable development indicator, which we really need more of, right? Things that can take into account simultaneously human affairs and environmental affairs and be receptive to both of them. And that's what we saw evidence of here. So for example, if we're engaging in activities that are destructive to the environment, may reduce well-being in order to create economic growth, which may increase well-being, both those effects would be reflected in this measure, not just one or another. So I want to just conclude with some further avenues, because there's a lot of graduate students and scholars here that may be interested in getting involved in this sort of work. And I'm happy to talk to anyone about that later. But I want to note, like in this study, right, is longitudinal. You can use something like the Gallup World Poll to do more of a time series analysis, which is important. So you think about things like satisfaction with local environmental quality and life satisfaction. It's not always necessarily clear which one may be influencing the other one. There are also, as you may have noted, there's a need to consider a lot of other environmental variables, including not just how people perceive the local environment, but objective variables. But this is a tough issue. I'm always interested in feedback on this because when you're doing cross-national research, and it's the case in the Gallup World Poll, you have people living in rural areas of developing countries, there's a problem with, I think the word would be granularity, right? It'd be nice to know what a lot of indicators are about that local environment. But in like the rural Congo, this is more difficult to find than perhaps in rural Vermont. So it really depends on sort of what data is being gathered at the national level or by different groups. And that granularity looks different in different places. So this can be one of the challenges I'm trying to find like good local environmental indicators for cross-national survey research. But I hope the concepts and just the work briefly presented here inspire both environmental scientists, other sociologists, social scientists to explore drivers of well-being, think critically about how we conceptualize it, including subjective well-being, and think about how it's relevant to not understanding just social conditions, but environmental conditions and as such, how they come together for sustainable development assessment. And so now, this is the end of my brief portion, and I'm going to turn things over to Kayleigh, where she's going to talk about some other sociological applications to environmental issues, but from a different perspective. Oh, this is a combined slide.
Yeah, we combined our slides. There's a little bit of a stylistic change happening. So please forgive the fact that we both have a title slide. I briefly just want to preface that I'm going to be taking us through a particular case study for us to explore environmental health and well-being, particularly through the avenue of how social inequality and environmental inequalities intersect in our water systems in the United States. So I'm going to walk us through for whom is water fairly priced, which is an issue we are investigating at Northeastern University for the past 4 years or so within SARE. To give you a brief debrief on why there is a demand for water justice and affordability in the US and why this is a critical issue over time for us, is that it's an increasing crisis. Water rates are increasing over time in comparison to the last 2 decades, 3 decades. Bills are becoming more unaffordable. And the people affected by this unaffordability tends to be low income and minority populations within the United States, disproportionately speaking. Because these bills are unaffordable, they are often more targeted by utilities through what we call cost recovery policies, or really cost penalties, where utilities will shut off people's water for non-payment of bills. They will put a lien on their property, they will fine them for non-payment, or they will use other fines or fees in order to compel people to pay unaffordable water bills. This is particularly an issue because utilities have increasing costs due to sort of the policy environment around water, where government agencies and laws compel utilities to comply with various regulatory laws around water quality and water safety. So what we have then is sort of a ramping up of clean water costs in the United States. And for those of you unfamiliar with this history, I'm sort of going to give a crash course on this. So there's federal regulation and compliance that water utilities in the United States have to adhere to. Those are usually passed through the Environmental Protection Agency or the EPA. And you might be familiar with laws like the Safe Drinking Water Act or the Clean Water Act. Of course, water sanitation, water quality is very important, but the ability for utilities to actually implement these within their service area through upgraded water treatment plants or sewer treatment plants can be difficult if they don't have the funding or revenue to do so. And so from the 1970s then, we have less federal funds for water operators actually to improve their water infrastructure and to not pass those costs actually onto consumers in their service area. So we call these increasing fixed costs. That's what I'm going to call these for the rest of today, are fixed costs. These are essentially increased operational costs and maintenance costs for these utilities. And then these intersect with very complex contextual realities within these different service areas. So the issues within, for example, Wichita, Kansas, are going to be different from those in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And so these utilities have complex local, ecological, social, and economic phenomena, things like climate change, which increase their costs, like drought, flood, those sorts of factors. Then we'll have the effects of poverty within these areas as well. Often when we talk about water access and affordability, the average resident in the United States is not very familiar with how much poverty there is within utility service areas. And so generally speaking, if we look at utilities as a whole across the United States, the average utility has a poverty prevalence of 30%, which is a lot higher than what people typically think. So this is a critical issue. And then you have at least 75% of utilities that have a poverty prevalence of 20% or greater. So the amount of poverty within water systems in the United States is actually quite high. And we have some outliers. We have people who only have a poverty prevalence of like 10%. That's still poverty, it's just less poverty. And then you have people who are way out on the far end of high poverty, with 70% of the service area, 80% of the service area being in poverty. And so utilities are contending with a variety of different burdens, both in terms of for these state mandated policies, regulation mandates, and limited funding. So they have these utility burdens, is what we call it, in comparison to having to balance sort of the human right to water, these human needs that customers have, such as clean water, accessible water, and affordable water. And of course, if the water is not affordable, it is not going to be accessible. So we find in our study sort of a comparison of these two things. How are utilities balancing these two critical pieces, their fixed costs and the human needs of their service area? And we looked at that through customer assistance programs. So utilities in the United States might provide ways in which for customers to pay their late bills. That does not mean the water bill itself becomes more affordable. People are just given more time to pay an inherently unaffordable water bill. And so utilities will deploy a variety of measures in order to deal with this. Typically, when we look at utilities in general, They all have elderly receiving discounts, which of course only targets a very small portion of people in need. And then you might have payment plans or debt forgiveness, which again, doesn't really make the water itself affordable. But we do see things like low income discounts, which are rare, and tiered income rates, which is essentially capping that water bill based on your income rather than on water use. So this is probably the most effective way to make water affordable in the United States. And essentially what we did is we looked at customer assistance programs between two different states, Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, and tried to evaluate the efficacy of these assistance programs. Are they actually doing what we need them to do? Are they providing the assistance that is necessary for people in poverty in these service areas, particularly low income and minority residents? And so, just sort of gonna put that here, broadly speaking, looking at what affects utilities adoption of these customer assistance programs as a social inequality issue and as an environmental inequity. How exactly do utilities use their different resources or their different capacities to advance the efficacy of their programs in assisting customers? And then we were actually really curious about how are utilities learning about how to fix the issue of water unaffordability? Because it could be that they're not actually learning at all about how to address water unaffordability, which is a bit of a foresight into the ending of this talk, which is they're not learning about how to address water unaffordability. And so our sample was 11 cities between Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, and we sort of matched these based on city size, poverty prevalence, and other demographical factors. We weren't trying to compare apples and oranges. We were trying to have a fair comparison across these two states. And then this was a qualitative study. So we did interviews with water operators, water staff, public officials, community advocates in this space who were rallying against water shutoffs essentially. And then also various consultants who work with these utilities to create different rate studies so that the utilities can figure out how much money they need to generate from their water revenue. So do we need to increase bills by $1 or $2 or $3 or a percentage, those sorts of things. And then we also collected data through FOIL requests. So we had a horde of law students who also participated on this project in sending out FOIL requests, freedom of information requests, to these utilities to provide us information on those cost recovery penalties that they might implement. How many shutoffs do they have? How many liens have they implemented? Who exactly have been targeted by those? So this was actually quite an arduous process because we would file these FOIL requests and sometimes they would not respond to us, or more often they would respond to the FOIL request with a long litany of past judicial cases on why they do not need to provide information to us. And then if they didn't do that, the third option was, sorry, we don't have this information for you. So this was about a 2-year-long process of doing this FOIL related work. And then from the interviews and the FOIL data, we did a comparative qualitative analysis. Due to timing today, I won't be going over representative quotes, but in the discussion, I have picked out some of your questions about what this actually looked like from the interviewee standpoints. I'm happy to talk about that later. So we're going to look at some key insights and findings. I said that we looked at city size and city poverty status. When we looked through the interviews and the data, the key piece that pattern responses actually wasn't the size of the utility, it was actually the prevalence of poverty. So interviewees would refer a lot to the poverty status of their utility or the poverty of their customers and limiting their ability to provide services to their customers. So we have high poverty utilities and low poverty utilities. And there's quite a stark contrast between how these types of utilities handle water unaffordability. So overwhelmingly, high poverty utilities were more likely to offer some form of assistance. That could be a payment plan, it could be a one-time financial hardship grant, it could be a discount on a particular part of their water bill, whether that's water or sewer. Some did have low-income discounts. So they had a variety of customer assistance programs. This was really important because these high poverty utilities often had much fewer financial resources. They're much more strapped in terms of the revenue coming in through their water billing system. And so we saw for high poverty utilities an enormous amount of innovation around trying to provide funding for assistance programs. The key thing here is that in the water sort of legal space, There's a little bit of discontent over whether or not you are allowed to use revenue from water bills to subsidize programs like this. And so utilities, in order to not get sued, will try to find other forms of revenue to fund these programs. So high poverty utilities were very aggressive in trying to find non-rate, non-water revenue related funding sources to finance these programs. So we saw utilities doing fundraising drives, donations, contacting advocacy groups, charity groups, trying to find one-off grants to fund these programs, using various types of non-water related fees to produce revenue. So stormwater fees, that's like runoff from your parking lot, charging businesses and buildings for producing stormwater. Things like tapping fees, meter fees, anything they could think of in order to generate revenue to fund these CAPS programs. And more often, high poverty utilities were much better in connecting with their local service areas by working with advocacy groups and telling them, hey, we need to do more community outreach. They want to try and reach as many eligible customers as possible to get them into the CAPS programs that they do have. That's in stark contrast to low poverty utilities, who were unfortunately very indifferent to offering assistance to their customers. So I want to make it clear again, these low poverty utilities still have people living in poverty. It could be 10%, 18%, but that's relative to a utility that has 40 or 45%. So I'd be better to say higher poverty and lower poverty. But they're very indifferent to offering assistance. They also tend to have much more flush funds. They often had a year-to-year surplus. They could put that into an interest accruing account, use those additional funds to fund infrastructure without taking on additional debt. And also that means they weren't passing as many costs onto consumers as high poverty utilities were. They often had no assistance programs. They did have an assistance program. It would be for elderly discount or things for like a small piece off of your water bill, but largely they were unconcerned with poverty related issues in their service area. And also, when someone would have a problem in the interview data, they would say, oh, we direct them to charity groups. We have no in-house mechanism to assist people who are dealing with unaffordable water bills. That was a common refrain from our interview data. And then also, they don't really work with members in the community to sort of do outreach on the assistance programs that they do have. So that's in terms of key insights on this. We can talk more about this in the discussion. But another key finding we have is in terms of policy insights and findings on really fixing water unaffordability. And overwhelmingly, in the interviews we had with advocates and with consultants, some of which were lawyers, they all talked about the fact that utilities have an issue with data collection and using that data to formalize information systems to understand what's going on in their service area. And so I'll get to the point on the right in a minute, but no city was able to provide us complete FOIL data. That indicates they're not able to either maintain those records, collect that information, that there's an issue with their record keeping and data management in general. And often consultants would complain about this because they don't have the information they need to do the analysis that utilities want. They have really outdated and undersized stock infrastructure, so IT, IS systems. And this is partially due to the fact that there's just not enough federal funding for our water infrastructure in the United States. And so if we were able to alleviate some of those fixed costs for utilities, we might see some more innovation around water unaffordability to help them track customer needs better. And then consultants played a really key role in our sample. We didn't expect consultants to be everywhere, but they are everywhere in everything and influence pretty much all board decisions, rate decisions, and even how CAPS may or may not be implemented. So consultants don't necessarily have the expertise that a health advocate, community advocate, or someone who does community analysis study would have. And so if consultants are used to evaluate customer assistance programs, they usually say, we'll just do like a blanket thing, which isn't really targeted or efficient in helping specific demographics. The other thing that happened is because they're relying on consultants, they're looking at how do I address my fixed costs right? Increasing operational costs. That's what they're using their learning and their resources to address, which means they're dissuaded from looking at how do I actually address water unaffordability? How might I generate knowledge around fixing this particular problem instead? And this highlights a major issue within sort of water policy law, transparency law requirements in the United States today, which is utilities are not actually required legally to record this type of data to let us know what demographics in particular are being harmed by shutoffs, liens, fees, and fines. And then that means people like us who are interested in this policy space, whether it's advocates, policymakers, researchers, whoever, we have to do a lot more footwork to try and find pieces of this information to evaluate how equitable these policies are in addressing social inequality, economic inequality in our water systems. And so our team sort of advocates the need for a federal water law around transparency of data. And so right now, there are only 2 states that have this type of law. The first was New Jersey, second was Illinois. And a couple weeks ago, we went to the State House in Massachusetts and gave testimony on a similar transparency law for Massachusetts. And if that goes through, Massachusetts will be the 3rd state to have a data transparency law to address some of these issues with water unaffordability. So with that, we're opening for discussion.